Hello, ladies. I want to quickly recap from the lesson from Tuesday, and then it's going to be about the same thing. Today, you're going to read and outline selections from the Texas History book, which I have uploaded to Dash Connect in the form of PDFs, and I will tell you to read certain pages, and then you're going to come back, and we're going to discuss it briefly in the video like we did on Tuesday. So, from Tuesday, hope you remember that we started off talking about the French and the English starting taking an interest in the New World. They started to give Spain a run for their money, and Spain started getting angry because, one, they thought it was against the Treaty of Tordesillas, and they did not want basically anybody else have any claims over the New World, over things that they already, attempted to settle. So they go to war with England for two reasons. One, it was over territory. They were angry about the treaty, and England was kind of landing in places where Spanish already had an interest. And secondly, it was over religion. England was Protestant, and Spain was Catholic. So on fundamental terms, they disagreed with one another, and so Spain went to war both to show England that they were stronger and to reestablish Catholicism within that country. Unfortunately for Spain, they lost their armada in the English Channel, or the majority of it, and Queen Elizabeth was the reigning monarch, and now England has the controlling navy in the New World. Some French explorers start to make their way up into Canada. Most of them were seeking a northwest passage, but when they found out there could not be a northwest passage with their ships, they started having settlements. So we talked about one in Quebec, there was one in Montreal that you should remember from the video, and both of those were fur trading settlements, and they also dealt very well with the Native Americans, both engaging them in their fur trading business and just in general they treated them a lot better. Now, we also talked about the Dutch, who settled in New York, specifically in New York City, because they bought Manhattan Island from a group of Native Americans, and both sets of settlements were very peaceful. Now, going on to Texas today, we're going to talk about the Spanish exploration in Texas, and basically what Spain was interested in, which you should have some idea as to what they were interested in by now, and how successful those explorations were. So I want you to open the PDF that I've loaded up to today's folder and read pages 94 to 96 and outline them, and then come back, hit play again, and we're going to discuss. So the first thing you read was the Pineda expedition. Pineda wanted to go along the Gulf Coast and just kind of explore and see what was there and to map out the area. He really didn't have any interest in landing anywhere unless he needed to resupply. He was interested in seeing how big the Gulf was, how extensive it was, if there were any major harbors, etc. So that was his only goal. To our knowledge, he really didn't set foot anywhere in Texas, but since he mapped it out so well, it increased the Spanish interest in the region. Then we talk about the Narvaez expedition. Now this one I'm going to spend a little bit more time on because it is known as one of the more epic failures in early exploration, especially since we're part of the Gulf Coast. So, just like pretty much every other expedition before them, these explorers wanted to land, and they wanted to find gold and riches so they could return home heroes. So they landed in Florida with about 300 men, which, let me flip back to this map. Spain had Cuba and a bunch of the other islands in the Caribbean right here. So Florida was the next closest place to land. It was logical for them. They had landed in Florida several times before, and there was also rumors that Florida had a lot of riches. So that's why Florida. So when Narvaez landed, he took 300 men on foot, and they were going to explore Florida, while the other 300 stayed with the boats and tried to search for a safe harbor. Now the the 300 explorers, as I'm going to call them, had a really tough time. The Florida terrain was terrible. It was very swampy. They ran into Native Americans. It just, basically anything that could happen did happen to these poor guys. And on top of it, guess what? No gold in Florida. So the remaining crew returned. They went to the shore to try to find the crew that stayed with the boats. Unfortunately, they took too long traipsing around in Florida, and that crew returned back to Spain, okay, never to return again. So in order to survive in the immediate future, they started eating their horses, which was not a desirable thing to do. You know, horses we don't typically raise for meat. And they lived off the land the best they could, but these guys weren't acclimated to the environment. They weren't used to eating off the land, and they just had a really rough time. They were able to slap together some rafts, and when I say slap together, and you read from your book, they literally were slapped together. They barely stayed above water when all of the men were on them, and your book says they sailed along the Gulf Coast. I don't know how much sailing they were doing on a little makeshift raft, but they kind of tooted along the Gulf Coast, hoping to not run into any kind of rough seas. Basically, they wanted to go all the way around the Gulf Coast until they could land in Mexico and walk to Mexico City, or to land in Mexico and get a boat home. That's all they wanted. But they ended up getting shipwrecked off of what they think was Galveston Island, or around San Luis Pass, which is all, within 50 miles of one another on the coast, and only about 80 men survived. So now, they have traipsed around Florida, their buddies went home, they built rafts, had a really hard time of it. Now when they crash landed, they lost their leader, and most of the men in the storm that made their boats crash had lost their clothing and most of the supplies they had on the raft. So they're literally standing there with nothing. Now, a group of Karankawa took them in and gave them a little bit of food, they gave them shelter, and they all tried to survive the winter. Now, unfortunately, most of the men died. There weren't that many left in the end, and those that lived were held captive by the Karankawa. They forced them into servitude, or they forced them into labor. Now, eventually, the men were sold into slavery with the Qualitekons. Now, with what you know of the Qualitekons, we can all understand that that was a very difficult existence. So they started off in Florida, took their little raft, tooted all the way around, crashed in Galveston, had to suck it up for the winter. Didn't work out very well for most of them, and then all of a sudden they're put into slavery, something of, where they had to have, hard labor and all that kind of stuff. Most of the guys weren't ready for this. So, good thing about this, though, was that we had a guy who eventually wrote memoirs about this, and his name is Cabeza de Vaca. So as he gets sold into slavery and learns to trade and to be a healer, he is traveling all around Texas and bumping into a whole lot of the different Texas tribes. And it took him 8 whole years to go all the way around here and eventually end up in Mexico City, and Cabeza de Vaca went home. Now, if you notice, this map is called Estevanico's route. Now, when they crash landed, there was a translator/slave that managed to survive, and his name was Estevanico, or Esteban. Instead of going home, he became kind of a trailblazer and would be a guide on different trips, and he actually joined up another expedition that went up to Cibola in New Mexico, but that's for another time. So, Cabeza de Vaca gets back to Spain, he publishes his story, becomes really famous. To kind of pay tribute to him, he is allowed to become governor of Paraguay later on in his life, but unfortunately for him, that governorship does not go very well. The people of Paraguay revolt. Cabeza de Vaca goes back to Spain, completely dishonored, and he kind of lost all credibility that he had gained by publishing his book in the first place. So you're going to pause again, read the last pages of the PDF, and then hit play, and let's finish the discussion. So now we're on to early explorers in Texas. So these are people that intentionally entered into Texas and helped to kind of change our landscape, and shape an attitude about the area that is now our home. So, we talked about Spanish explorers wanting to find gold. There were several other attempts to find gold. So Esteban, the map up there, that was one of the attempts, I believe, to find gold. None of them ever came to anything. They searched and searched, and little did they know they were in the wrong part of the country to find gold. They needed to be over in California. But the men still tried. That was the best way to gain fame and honor back home. So we meet up with this guy named Juan de Onate. So he was allowed to start a colony in what is now New Mexico. So if you want to take a look at this map, this is Mexico as we know it down here. Mexico City is right here. All of this is considered Mexico at this time. So when I say New Mexico, I mean where the current state is. They refer to it as Norte Mexico because it was the northern part and this was Mexico itself. Just depends kind of who you talk to. Now, the reason they wanted him to set up a colony was because, if you notice, this is a huge chunk of land. The only people that are really living here, other than explorers or missionaries that set up actual settlements, were natives. Now, the worry was that eventually you're going to have other Europeans land and they're going to come into your territory. What if they decide to set up a colony? Well, the only way that Spain can combat that is if they already have settlements in the area and they can defend their claim. So Santa Fe was kind of on the outskirts. Santa Fe is up here. And what he did was he took a group of people and they walked all the way from Mexico City. And your book talks about them having to go through the Chihuahuan Desert. Okay, go through the Chihuahuan Desert, met up with the Rio Grande. Okay, they had a woohoo, finally found water. And they followed the headwaters of the Rio Grande all the way up into Santa Fe. So along the way, they hoped to spread Christianity, but he was also excited about searching for gold himself. So he had a small party that went off to go and search the Pueblo regions, which are kind of over here, and eventually kind of went off into Texas a little bit. But he found no gold, and because of this, they really didn't think much of the areas of Texas at the time. They thought it had nothing to offer. In this area, there really isn't a whole lot of natural resources that they could use at the time. There's no wood, there's no vegetables, and or cool fruits or things, and if there was, how are they supposed to get it back? So they basically left Texas completely unexplored for the next 80 years. Now, the effects of exploration in Texas. So, the Spanish exploring gave them claim to the land. They mapped it, they knew it, they understood the people knew who they were. That when the French started coming in over in East Texas and trading with the Caddo, they knew that they were different people. But some of the Spanish created levels of respect with the Native Americans, and they could deal with them more positively in the future. Now, the other thing that Texas served, even though it was just kind of a vast wilderness at the time, was it was a buffer between the Native Americans and other European colonies. So a lot of the more aggressive Native American tribes were in central Texas, and that helped to keep, they felt that there was enough distance between those Native Americans and Mexico City. Now, that also brought a whole lot of disease with it, so a lot of our Native American tribes that we had in Texas started dying off because they made contact with the early explorers, just like the Aztecs and the Incas. But the one good thing that came out of it is called the Columbian Exchange. And this is more easily explained with this picture. The Columbian Exchange is named for Christopher Columbus, okay, so not the country. We call it the Columbian Exchange because it is the exchange of goods that come from Europe and Asia to the New World, and the goods that come from the New World back to Europe. So since Columbus sailed over here in 1492, he's one of the first explorers, he gets credit for the name. But pause it here for a second and look at the different items that were traded and kind of make note of some of the good things and some of the bad things. Now, horses were the next thing. They completely changed the way the Plains tribes operated. It made their nomadic lifestyle easier. They could hunt and fight better, and they actually started attacking the Spanish, particularly the Apache, because they were encroaching on their lands. This continued with all of the other European explorers because they kept trying to claim native lands, which the natives thought was their own. Now read the slides so you can figure out what is next. You guys are going to be watching a video and taking some more notes today.